Thank you again all for coming today for this lecture. And before we will start, I want to thank once again Pilecki-Institut, because today when I spoke with Professor Yurii Shapoval and telling the whole story background of the beginning Ukrainian program here, I also remind myself also once again how all stories started with Pilecki-Institut. Basically on the on the first day of the full-scale invasion, Hania Radziejowska, who will be speaking here in a minute, has proposed us with and sent to us people to propose to us come to here, organize here call center, working place, Ukrainian crisis stab, so to say. And like in 2 days, there was like 200 Ukrainians here around the whole space, working, trying to provide their help. I think I also remember the story because today is a very difficult day, and that's once again feels like the beginning of something huge, and once again you are really afraid that international organization will not react properly or be ignoring the situation for a while, and it will cost human lives. So that's why I'm very honored to invite Hania Radziejowska, Director of Pilecki-Institut Berlin. And once again, a huge applause for all support.
Thank you very much. I think the most important is this applause for our Ukrainian friends, Ewa Jakubowska, who is curator of this program, Freedom Ukraine. I mean, we feel always very honored for having you here and having this opportunity to get to know Ukraine better and do everything what we can to not only support, but in this meaning to help to understand what does it mean, what does it mean, what is Russia, and who are Ukrainians. I think it's for us, it's very important. We hope that we together here in Berlin can follow this very important journey, yes. And I think it's really a very sad paradox that today, this unveiling the dark chapters, Soviet crimes against Ukraine, this lecture is taking place on the day when Russia has shown again its criminal face. And I mean, I was many times thinking that how important, I mean, that everything starts from understanding the history. Because if we would listen to this Eastern countries' experience, probably, I hope, we would be in completely different place. Because I hope, I will repeat, because it means that if we know this history, probably there is a chance that we will, I mean, these democratic values, Ukraine will win, yes, and that this never again will be not just the slogan, but something which can come true. And dear Professor, thank you very much. It's a huge honor to having you here. And yes, it's let's really this opportunity to listen to these stories, to listen to the history of Ukraine and what Soviet Union, what Soviets, what Russia did for many, many years in Ukraine. Let's try to understand it and to listen, to avoid in future these atrocities, and I mean that stop them in this meaning. Thank you very much. Thank you, Eva, and Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I will just interrupt for the minute, and now I will start to speak in Ukrainian because I privilege to speak, and that's quite important. Друзі,
dear friends, today's event is happening within Volia UA, a program of Pilecki-Institut. Volia, the will. This is not just liberty. This is something which our generations, many generations fought for, and the history of this fight, the struggle. was eliminated. And this is not the first event within this program which is focused on the stories about the memory history of Germany, and that Ukraine was not in the focus of that history. The first part of this event already took place. It took place on the day of commemoration of the victims of communist regime near the Brandenburg Gate. We showed the terrorism sign to show how far away it is from the Brandenburg Gate to another sign of Soviet regime, the Treptower Park, which has 16 quotes of Joseph Stalin. Another 6 quotes are represented in Pankov, in Siegessäule, this victory column also is a symbol of Soviet Union. Another symbol means not only for Ukraine but for other victims of Soviet Union is presented on the facade of Russian embassy. And still 1941, 1945, those dates are still being used in Russia, and the year of 1939 is being ignored, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact as well. Or maybe the Russian house with 7 storages, with a huge territory which is still actively operating and not only showing films but also producing films. And it is important for us to show that the history is not only something mythical which exists on the pages of textbooks. It is important for us to show that history means responsibility. It is quite dangerous not to take the responsibility, because the memory then is being drawn by a dictator. Once this was a Soviet dictator, and now it is somebody else, some other dictator. Today, Timothy Snyder published another article of his about the martial law. He started by saying, quote, "Путінська система має витоки і логіку." So he said, he named the regime, the Putin regime, without saying, without naming the imperialistic trends of the Russians, the trends from their past. But origin and logic, those words are really true. And today, during this lecture, we are going to learn where those origin and logic come from of the Russian imperialistic regime. And now, dear professor, the floor is all yours.
Okay, we will switch and we will be standing. Зараз поки я не впевнена. Так. Just a second, and I think it will work. I've tried this. Так.
I would like to start by I would like to thank you for the invitation, for the chance to come to Berlin. And I'm always wondering, when this topic, which I have been dealing by many years, because I'm dealing with bad guys, I'm always wondering why people are interested by those guys, by the special forces and Chekists and other people. So I will tell about them later on. So thank you for your interest. Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining the conversation. Once upon a time, a writer said the following. I was younger, and I was surprised. This was a post-Soviet person who had Soviet experience. He said something like this: almost all of the Soviet history has secrets, and most of them are unpleasant. And this is true. This is really true. No matter which topic you deal with, you will find a secret within it. And let me start by touching about on some point you may have heard about. I mean the so-called Great Terror, 1937-1938, which started quite by itself. A new wave of repression rolled upon the Soviet Union. There were no collectivizations, there was no law, there were no multi-party system, there were no struggle against regime, obvious struggle, but instead planned and massed special operations emerged. They were called exactly special operations, the way that Putin called his operation. And multiple false accusations emerged, and an official use of torture emerged, because Stalin himself, and there is a telegram stating it, well, those tortures happened before, but not that massively. But Stalin himself allowed it, so which meant that the inmates, they could do pretty much everything to them. And the close character of trials. And all of that was supported by massive propaganda campaign where people had to give oaths to the regime and criticize the so-called enemies of the people. And this was really surprising. And another thing which has been done in these modern Russians, the Chekists, they supported the whistleblowing, both in Moscow and in regional centers. They have made drawers where people could put their notes, and the Chekists, so the special forces, were supposed to check those news, and this was a massive phenomenon during that period, a peak of this phenomenon. So there were no existential threat to Stalin's regime, but there was the terror. So the question is, why? Many years, scientists have been trying to find an answer. Back then, and the scholars like Timothy Snyder, who has already been mentioned, are trying to find the answer. And let me tell you, let me give you a reply by help of Winston Churchill. You know many quotes of him, but there is a super quote on Soviet Union. Soviet Union was something he hated, even though there were different periods of his relationship to Stalin, but he hated communism, and he knew for sure what system he dealt and just instrumentalized the system. So he said, what is the Soviet Union actually? This is a secret wrapped into another secret, which again reveals a mystery. So only Churchill could have come upon this quote, but it is absolutely true. Let me start with Stalin's date of birth. This is the same with Putin. So the dictators, they repeat many things, more or less. And nevertheless, many scholars tried to reveal those secrets, but there are still many secrets to be revealed, and to understand why so many people in Soviet Union had to pay not only with their illusions, because they had illusions that this society was just, that everyone was equal, but not only illusions, but their lives was the price they paid. This is important to prevent these events which were reborn in modern Russia. And this is so sad to see how Russianism is being reborn today. So you may look for another definition of what is happening. And let me tell you another thing. About the so-called Great Terror. This is a broad kind of topic, but this is really voiced, and it must be researched, and it has been researched a lot, but let me emphasize one thing. Who started criticizing the Soviet regime? Who were those people? The participants of the regime. And this is fantastic. Leo Trotsky, for example, the fantastic figure who actually founded the Red Army. So he was really an active person and really energetic, but he was a competitor to Stalin, and he was in exile and killed in Mexico in 1940. So he wrote a book, Stalin, a really fundamental book, and it was published in Soviet Union only in 1990. And he described many features of Soviet regime. And back in 1920s, 1930, there were many people in the West who wrote about the regime. The ex-Chekist, Boris Bajanov, for example, who used to be or called himself Stalin's personal secretary. So those problems were already present in the social discourse. Everyone talked about the character of Stalin regime, which was not that positive. And interestingly, after the World War II, witnesses of concentration camp survivors emerged, or those who fled to the West. For example, Viktor Kravchenko, I don't know if you know him. He comes from the city of Dnipropetrovsk. He was a military person. He was an orthodox communist and took part in anti-rural actions. And 1944, he joined the delegation of Soviet Union in Washington and fled. Kravchenko wrote a book, I Choose Freedom. And because of that, he was accused of being a CIA agent. Lévy, Lettre Française, a French newspaper, accused him of that, and Jean-Paul Sartre, philosopher, was among those who accused him of this. And Kravchenko said, I will go to court. And 1949, there was a trial in Paris, a trial of the century, and Kravchenko had a speech in English, and he defended himself. But those in the hall and Sartre himself, they could not believe what he said. Gulag and hunger, famine in the Soviet Union, this was supposedly impossible. And Kravchenko was the one to win the trial. I met his son, who lives in Los Angeles and came to Kiev. I asked him, who funded your dad when he went to Paris? He said he used his honorarium for the book. So he funded himself, basically, by that means. And another thing, I would like to tell you another story. We were sitting in a restaurant in Kiev near the red building of the university. I asked, "Where is your father buried?" And Andrew, his son, says, "This is a good question." He took a capsule out of his bag and says, "My father is here. This is his ashes. And what are you about to do with it? I will go to Dnipropetrovsk and let it flow with the wind." So this was an interesting episode. So Kravchenko was one of the people who wanted to bring this truth across to the West. And so what do you think the communist regime would do? They didn't react at all. After the trial of Nuremberg, the prosecutor, American prosecutor named Robert Jackson, wrote to the Soviet prosecutor Roman Rudenko. And he wrote him something. So he wrote something like this: "Let us not speak about certain issues during the trials." And one of those was the issue about the social political structure of Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union was also interested about speaking about the Baltic countries. So they didn't want to touch upon the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Everyone knew what kind of regime it was, but there was no way out.
До влади прийшов Хрущов, коли він ізолював Берію, виштовхнув його з цієї політичної арени. І після його закритої доповіді в 1956 році, яка містила абсолютно чіткі алюзії на наявність табірної системи, на чистки, от почалася дискусія про спрямованість і масштаби беззаконь у сталінські часи. Ну, але переломним моментом всі вважають вихід книжки професора, поета, дипломата і розвідника Роберта Конквеста. Це вважається таким переломним етапом. У 1968 році з'явилась його книжка, яка так і називається «Великий терор». І Конквест відзначив 3 особливості оцих масових чисток в Радянському Союзі. По-перше, це небачений масштаб, величезний масштаб, коли кожного члена суспільства тримали в постійному страху. Ну, ви знаєте, що Умберто Еко описував феномен фашизму і написав про те, що одна з ознак, з його точки зору, це якраз привчити громадян жити в очікуванні постійної небезпеки, нападу, відчувати себе в оточенні ворогів. Те, що достатньо успішно зроблено в путінській Росії сьогодні. По-друге, Роберт Конквест описав методи, якими чистки проводили. Тут були публічні судилища насамперед, але зверніть увагу, насамперед жертвам треба було покаятись. Окей. Отже, Конквест писав про небачений розмах чисток, коли гинули мільйони і людей стримали в постійному страху. Він писав про методи, якими ці чистки проводилися, і про публічне судилище, де жертви мали обов'язково покаятися. Їх потім могли пристрелити, але спочатку вони каялись і підписували зізнання. І нарешті, третя риса, дуже важлива і дуже серйозна – це таємниця.
That they truly done the bad things, and it was also another method that he was describing, that the things that were happening in such a huge amount is not being said publicly. For example, it also was completely changed by the people and by the government, and the way that they were describing it, it was huge, the lies that they were telling and that the government was telling the people. And it was, and those lies and the misinformation was basically fed to the West for many, many years. What was interesting in Conquest's book is what he was talking about Ukraine, and it was called the Ukrainian chapter. And the work of Conquest is also being edited in West in 1973 and 1975, and also the book from Archipelago. Also, they were being describing that the Great Terror, and also his that the Great Terror wasn't happening in the Soviet Union. That was what was described in the book. But until the 80s, that the Great Terror, that its problem was being described in a much more sense than it actually was happening, and that it wasn't as easy as described, and that we had to see the perspective in which I could meet and was talking to the Arch Getty from the USA, Gabor Rittensport. He was living in Paris and I met him there, and I would say that he also lives there now. And Robert Truston, who also is from the US, and he is younger than the two that I mentioned before. They are trying to describe the wave of the terror, that no one was inspiring this terror, that everything was lies, and that everything was propaganda, and that on the top of Kremlin no one was doing that, and no one was planning to do the Great Terror. And they were calling the Great Terror a very beautiful sense that they were using, that it was war of everyone against everyone, and that everyone was saying that it was starting on the lower level, not on the higher level. They also declined that Stalin was repressing or oppressing anything, or that he had repressing or repressive politics. And they said that Stalin was one of the victims of the Great Terror. That's the way that they described it during the Soviet Union. And this is what happened during the Gorbachev rebuild. The archives were opened up, and they came to Moscow. And they said that they won't write anything, that they will buy a table for billiard, and that they don't want to do anything with history or write anything about it. So their perspective was being changed. I want to remind you of one of the factors that had a big sense. In 1989 in Moscow, there was a journal magazine that was being published. And it held and was published till 1999, till the putsch, and then it was closed. And it is a magazine that was published from the party money financing, and that you had to understand that the Great Terror was an actually planned terror and not just a thing that happened on its own. And we can see that Moscow Center was doing the scripts and publishing them for the people on the lower grounds. After that, from the archives came a lot of documents that were describing the revisionists and basically proving that initiators of 37-38 were basically having their own plan, and that they were making their own technologies and actions and describing the categories of victims. And there were a lot of things happening in Ukraine. Ukraine was happening in 1994, a unique publishing, a magazine that is still published now. From the archives, it is called they're basically publishing a lot of different articles, and in this publishing we can see a lot of archival documents, and they all are being published in Ukrainian language. And the Western professors that can read in Ukrainian are very interested in this magazine, and this magazine also showed who was the initiator of the Great Terror. How does the Great Terror started? It started from the opposition, from Lenin, who was basically shutting up and shutting down the critics for him, and also the philosophers and anyone who was the opposition for him, and the other part had to stop talking, had to lie along, because the structures were basically being kept, and that's the way that Stalin was doing at the same time, neutralizing any opposition, neutralizing anyone who spoke the truth, someone like Trotsky, and basically spreading lies and propaganda. The next step was any actions done after the opposition and people who went again. It was very important to shut down people who were active and not give them the chance to be active. And also the Great Terror, the third one, was basically pushed onto the civilization, onto the society, onto the normal people. The fifth colony that was waiting for the intervention of the enemies of the Soviet Union, that was the lies that were being spread. This way, the Great Terror was basically a way of making the dictatorship of Stalin more mighty and powerful. But in theory, it could be thought of how to make these plans to come to reality. This is being done by people, and Stalin was the master in that, of choosing, making a choice. He found Mykola Ivanovich Yezhov, a small person who was not very tall, very small, not a Chekist, not the way that Gendrich Yagoda was. He was a Chekist. Yezhov wasn't, just a normal person who didn't work in such organs, in such ways. And in September 1936, he put him as the head of inner politics. He was the worker of the party. And the thing was that Yezhov was writing a brochure that was called From Fractions to Counter-Revolution. It was published in 1935, and he gave it to Stalin and said, look at this is what I wrote for now, and this is everyone who basically was a fractionist and was against the party is our enemy, and we need to fight against them. And Stalin was editing the brochure by himself. He did it by himself. He read a lot, and he read it seriously. He didn't do just notes. He seriously read it. And look, in 1937-38, Stalin was accepting Yezhov 300 times, and he was spending 900 hours talking to him. In 20 months of January 1937 until 1938, he accepted from Yezhov 15,000 different messages, special messages, that he gave to him about any operations, messages about sanctions and repressions and oppressions, and basically protocols from all of the questions that he asked from the people that were victims and that were taken by the repressions and who were the opposition. Yezhov was demonstrating that he had a very strong and aggressive character, and he basically was, in 1937, It was a forum where he was. Yezhov was for 3 days explaining to Stalin from the 23rd of February until the 26th about the repressions and the oppressions that he. There is articles in the archives and the documents that you can check, but the most interesting one is that when he was being on that plenum, Yezhov said that enemy is that the Chekists were constantly basically making the documents false. I need to tell you seriously that there was a practice that basically giving
so this protocol maybe have been looked through by the narkom, so the highest superior, and he gave his notes, and then this text was given to the convict for them to sign it. But the fact is, he confessed that the whole procedure was false. And next, during the terror, we mustn't forget about it, I suppose, or when something is being made in favor of the dictator, the material factor plays a great role, which was also the case in Soviet Union. In 1933, the average salaries in Soviet Union was 142 rubles. Under these conditions, what does Yezhov do? He raises the salaries of the secret officers, the Chekists, of all levels. I used to write something about this several Vsevolod Bavlitsky, the narkom, the superior in Ukraine till 1937. He was abolished, eliminated. Well, so the superior of the NKVD of this Ministry of Internal Affairs in certain regions started to get the salary of 1,200 rubles. So this was great money, but it's not all. Moreover, the Chekists, so in Soviet Union, everything was deficit, so you must remember, so going for a holiday was a great problem because everything was in deficit, and the Chekists, the secret service officers, they shared these sanatoriums, those resort places, with the party officers. And since that time, they could enjoy their own resorts. And additionally to that, they got additional money, the health money, so to speak. So they have gotten the so-called brown envelopes. So brown envelopes, this was additional money that the party officers got, and the secret service officers got the health money. So what am I trying to say? They knew what they were working for. So Stalin, starting with the Trotsky fans, he expanded his politics, his policy on a great number of people. A couple of words about Ukraine. What happened in Ukraine by the time of the start of the Great Terror? When Yezhov came to power, Ukraine already had massive terroristic operations and total purge of the elites. And we can remember or recollect terrorist operations of the dekulakizations. 1,200,000 people were killed during these massive operations. The famine of 1932-1933, which is now normally called Holodomor. And minimally, it took lives of from 4 to 4.5 billion people, so according to different quotes. Well, this number is being introduced by 2 French demographers and 1 Ukrainian demographer. In Ukraine, the representatives of the intelligence were also prosecuted, and especially after the performative trial in Kharkiv in 1913, spring of 1930. And let me also remind you of Vesna, the spring operation, which touched upon the military servicemen in Ukraine. They wanted to get them confess that they were uniting with the rebels from the rural areas, and they were trying to prepare a complot, and they were punished by famine as well for that. Interestingly, the Czechs, the Secret Service officers, have always seen Ukrainians as potential dangerous mass. When someone was being watched by the Secret Service, they always gave them the so-called shade in their slang. So the shade that Ukrainian God was Ukrainian chauvinist or Ukrainian counter-revolutionist. So this was the shade, the attitude towards Ukrainians, and many reports about the thoughts among Ukrainians are still kept till now. And there was another notion, Ukrainian chauvinistic intelligence. So they put they have drawn great attention to the intelligence, so to the remnants of Ukrainian People's Republic. This material is still not researched well enough. This material is still of great interest. It is interest from different perspectives. Well, the Czechs, the Secret Service officers, they never identified themselves with Ukraine. Just imagine, they deemed themselves being some kind of a company serving the people. So this was their wording. They actually wrote it, we are serving the population, the people. So they were people and the Secret Service officers, and they had the good rights to act respectively. And what is interesting as well, in 1923, the so-called routization policy started. Officially, it starts by the 12th conference of the party. What was it? The Bolsheviks were not really popular in the outskirts of the imperium. So what was the way to stimulate people to love them? They were stimulating the local elites by showing that they were supporting their culture and even their languages. And they were supposed to serve them. And in the peak of this routization, where there were so many Ukrainian books, where a great number of poets and writers emerged that would later be called the prosecuted Renaissance, an interesting document emerges in Kharkiv, a document of 75 exemplars appears. So this document had to be kept encrypted, and for internal usage is called about the Ukrainian society or publicity. And according to the document, the Secret Service officers in 1926, the routization lasts for 3 years already. They are stating that this process, the routization, is dangerous, allegedly dangerous, that it can harm the state, that it supports the bourgeoisie Ukrainian nationalism. And the routization itself will disappear, actually disappear in 1932 and will be officially abolished a little bit later. It will decline since 1932, but back then, 1926, the Czechs, the Secret Service officers, state that there are 2 institutions that deserve special attention as the most dangerous ones. Do you know which institutions these were? The All-Ukrainian Academy of Sciences and the Ukrainian Autocatholic Church. So they could see the biggest concentrations of dangerous people. So they wanted to just abolish the brain from the nation, to abolish the people that have knowledge and can be useful now or later on for Ukraine. And it was not that easy, not that simple. Thing is that by that time, Ukraine experienced a really massive work. I'm not exaggerating, it was really massive. It was an exaggerated work on creating of dictionaries of Ukrainian languages. So big Ukrainian languages have been prepared. So they knew for sure what they were talking about. When they spoke about the Academy of Sciences, they were not speaking about the management, they were speaking about the structure around the Academy of Sciences. So what do we see here? We can see that there was the official course of routization, but parallel to that, the Secret Service were starting an anti-Ukrainian policy, anti-root policy. They were tracing people who were taking active part in routization so that they can later on find them easily. And this is the only way that we can explain the fact that since later 1920s, when Stalin announces his dekulakization, they are prosecuting the active Ukrainians, and the first arrests started back in 1929. And this is an interesting thing. I don't know if you are aware about the Union of Liberation of Ukraine, which was the first victim of this process. I am now editing a book of a film editor, Elias Nigerov, who is already passed away, who was tortured to death by KGB back in 1998. He died in hospital. He was really handsome. He was really energetic. And by chance, he learned that his mother was the one to write a denunciation on this case. I don't know if this was a goodwill of his mother or not, but this inspired him to write a book, Bullets for Shooting. And before his arrest, he hoped to deliver to someone this manuscript. But he is describing the arrest of the Union of Liberation of Ukraine. The process took place, the trial took place in Kharkiv in the Philharmonic. It is really beautiful. I don't know if these missiles hit it. Actually, a very beautiful building. And this trial was called, ironically, the SVU opera. SVU, so the Ukrainian Liberation Union, and GPU, the main management of internal affairs. Okay, this was a joke. So you must imagine they were imitating a court trial hall. And the hall was full of people. I went there to Kharkiv, and I was in that old theater. It doesn't exist anymore. But anyways, interestingly, well, most interesting is the fact is that there were 45 convicts with Sergei Yefremov, an academist of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, philologist, really famous, but he was involved in the Ukrainian Central Council, really short time, a couple of months, but this was enough to bring him to this trial. And you must imagine there are partially Czechists and partially some other people like diplomats, like an open trial, the only open trial in Ukraine. There was not a single open trial in Ukraine since that time. There was some in Moscow, but not in Ukraine. Anyways, the prosecutors, the lawyers are speaking with the convicts as if they were their friends. They are bringing them some cheese and some cakes, some cookies, and they are witnessing like we were planning to kill those and those, and we were planning to poison some patients. And one of the school principals from Kiev says we were planning to hang the pioneers on their red scarves. And without any drama, this was incredible. The people in the hall, they could not really imagine that the convicts could be willingly confessing things like this. But if we look closely, there was only one document in this trial, a diary of academist Yefremov, presented by his nephew. The academist was taking notes, and he was hiding this diary in his wardrobe, and his nephew discovered this diary and produced it to trial. And out of this trial, we know that academist Yefremov didn't love the Soviets at all. This is it. This was quite a farce, quite a false process, quite a false trial, ending with a tragedy. All of the convicts were convicted to death, and Yefremov was called to come to Moscow to see Stalin. And he was supposed to sign a letter to Ukrainians in exile for them to stop fighting against us, the Soviets. So he was just supposed to sign the document, and he declined. So this was the way he defined his further destiny. He died officially back in 1939 in one of the camps. So you may say 45 people, okay, they were convicted, arrested, 250 later on. And then they arrested 30,000 according to the same case. And the peasants who got arrested, they didn't even know what the Ukrainian Liberation Union was, but they got arrested allegedly because they had something to do with it. So you can see this superficial level to prove that that Ukrainian People's Republic is worth nothing, and people dealing with it are worth nothing. And then this circle, like the circles on the water, touched upon other people gradually. I wanted you to know about these trials because it was open, but there were multiple closed trials. As Andreas Kapelev once wrote, there was a popular book by him. It was popular in Germany. Kleine Geschichte der Ukraine, this little history of Ukraine. So I quote, "It was not by chance that those penal actions in Ukraine happened in Ukraine earlier than in other regions. The strategical, economic importance of Ukraine and the close connection of Ukrainians to Russians and a great number of Ukrainians, all of this contributed to the fact that the Russians tried to involve Ukrainians closer to the center compared to other regions. And this is also supported by desacrificed documents kept in the archives of the Secret Service of Ukraine. I don't want to overload you with those details, but let me tell you, as soon as the Stalin regime felt its power, they attacked not only the people that had to do with the Ukrainian People's Republic, but they started attacking people serving the regime who realized the policy of fruitization. So Alexander Shumsky and Mykola Skripnik, both ministers of education, they were different persons. The first was an SR, and Mykola Skripnik was a Bolshevik but Ukrainian patriot. But this was enough. Skripnik shot himself. He committed suicide when he was accused of political sins, and Shumsky was sent to exile to Solovki, but he survived Solovki. And then he was really ill, but kept living in Krasnoyarsky Krai. And he was killed in 1946 when he served his sentence. He was supposed to go to Ukraine, and Pavlo Sudoplatov, whose memoir Special Tasks you may have heard of. He is one of the symbolic heroes of Putinist Russia. He had to do with the assassination of Yevhen Konovalets back in 1938. So this was the destiny of those people. And in this respect, let me also touch upon another page of this history. Speaking of the Solovki, Shumsky was staying in Solovki, but he could break away, fleed. He didn't sign any protocol. He was extremely tough. I don't know which price he had to pay for it, but they agreed with Sudoplatov. When Sudoplatov was arrested in Moscow during the thaw, he also didn't sign anything, and stated it in his memoirs. You should never sign any protocol if you happen to be in this kind of situation. But there is another unpleasant page connected to Solovki, and let me close and wrap up this place in order not to tire you too much. Since spring 1937, NKVD, the Narkomat Ministry of Internal Affairs, arrests more than 700,000 people. Why? For what purpose? They are choosing the most obvious candidates. Excuse me these notions, but the most obvious 30,000 are being shot at spot because there's no place for them. They built extra camps where people are busy hacking wood. This is an easy task, but what are you supposed to do with so many people? And then Yurov, he was a creative person. In fact, he came up with an idea. Let us deload the prisons. So, in his words, let us kill them to get spare place in prisons. And this is what they did, but in quite a different manner. Besides, many other people convicted. Well, you must understand, 1937 was not an easy year. If you go back to 1927, this was the peak of collectivization, and the people who served the sentence of 10 years, they go out of prisons, and what are you supposed to do with them? They cannot become Soviet people. You can impossibly let them out of prison. So this decision on the load of prison touches upon Solovki as well. So I was lucky. I visited Solovki twice, but as a tourist, thank God. Back in 1977, my wife and I went then, and you cannot imagine what we saw then. And then, second time, we took part in a filming of a documentary back in 2008. This was a different picture. Even hotels were there in place. But the normal people, they live the same life as back in the 1930s. But I saw how these look like, where the prisoners, where the inmates actually lived. So what the Secret Service officers did, they opened new cases of the people who are sitting and serving their services. They cannot kill them just like that. They are trying to get them confess another crimes. And you may say the terror was unplanned. It was planned. So they were doing all of those things. And for sure, there were many whistleblowers among those prisoners. And this is a fact. We were visiting Arkhangelsk branch of FSB. And we took of a book, the latest address. Having all of these inmate cases. So they are defining the circle of people, and there were 1,200 people, so they are totally anti-Soviet and they cannot go back to the society. They must be eliminated. So I don't know by what reason, but again, 1,100 people are left. Among them, 205 Ukrainians. Les Kurbas, theater director who started in Europe and who started Berezil Theater in Kharkiv. Mykola Zarov, specialist of antique literature who translated Virgilius and the great poet. So really surprising persons. Artem Grushelnitsky, who came from abroad and took his family, his son Taras, so the whole family, entire family, and he is also among the people of this group. Famous researchers, Stepan Rudnitsky, geographer, Matkevi Yavorsky, historian, who was a communist. And he was loyal to the system, and there were many other interesting persons. And this was where our heroes of the Ukrainian Liberation Union, Kolya Pavlushkov, who represented this diary, the head of Ukrainian After-Catholic Church, Vladimir Chukivsky, and other many interesting people. They are being brought to Medvezhyegorsk. I visited Medvezhyegorsk at Belomor Canal and its headquarters. So they are choosing a cliff of Sandarmokh and are planning a massive shooting. They are digging a hole and bringing the first party of the people, and they are giving the task to Captain Mikhail Matveyev, who is not really upset with this task. And people who are going to Sandarmokh, they know for sure this is their last trip, and they try to fight against it. And Matveyev shot 250 people per day, normally, with his own very hands. And next party, what he does, he lets them all undress and ties their hands behind their backs so they can impossibly flee. So they put them at the edge of the row and shoot them. You may know Yurii Dmitriev, who is now in a camp. He discovered Sandarmokh, actually, and then later a group from Leningrad to St. Petersburg with Benjamin Yoffa from Memorial came to that place, and they were making exclamation. But it was Dmitriev, and it was not by chance that Putin imprisoned him. He didn't imprison Dmitriev, he imprisoned the memory about this crime, about this atrocity, which is proven. So this is the way they killed this entire group of Ukrainians. So the history of Ukrainian Liberation Union and other histories and communist activists, all of them are happen to be in one cliff of Sandarmokh. 509 prisoners of Solovki were killed later on in Koiron-Kanhas. So this was the place where they found their deaths, and the last group of the prisoners were called directly in Solovki, and then they will close this group. So this is the Ukrainian trace in Solovki. Ukrainians went there every year on the 5th of August. This is the day of political prisoner, to commemorate them. When we went there, the Russian military servicemen searched us, our bus with the dogs. They didn't find anything, but this was the way it was. Yurii Dmitriev is now in prison, and Mikhail Matveyev, who shot the people, he survived. He survived. He went to pension, he became a pensioner. He was convicted, not because he was shooting people. Vice versa, he has got promoted for his shooting. He was convicted for some other sin, and he was living calmly and easily till 1974, as if he didn't kill more than 1,000 people. So this is quite a weird story. Kolya Pavlushko, the nephew who presented the diary, wrote from Solovki, the officers told me that they would let me go if I give them the diary, but the Kolya Pavlushko also died in Sandarmokh. So this is the way it was. The Ukrainian trace can also be found on this page.
And another very important thing that I want to tell you about, there was a French person who was called Jacques Rossi. Maybe someone from you knows him. He is an author of a very important book about the prisoners in prisons. He was a very young person, very naive, and he went to Moscow as a translator to work. And someone caught him there because he was a French spy, and they gave him 20 years of prison. But he survived, and he came back to France, where he basically made a diary about the prison years that he spent there, 20 years, an amazing book that you can read that is amazing and describes a lot. And Jacques Rossi told him said very important words in that book. I was in 10 different totalitarian places in Soviet Union, but I never met a Russian person who was criticizing someone for bourgeoisie nationalism. But for everyone who was not Russian, they were blamed for being a bourgeoisie nationalist. Basically, this costs a lot because a French person noticed that. Why am I remembering that? Because whatever happens in Ukraine, regime always came and went to fight against the Ukrainian nationalism or the Polish operation that was awful in Ukraine. Everyone was always looking for Ukrainian nationalists, and every regime comes that. In 1932, Stalin was basically writing in the letter to Stakhanov that the whole party of Ukrainian 5,100 people were basically Ukrainian nationalists or bourgeoisie nationalists, all of them. And everyone was having that opinion about the Ukraine, and even now about the nationalism that is being told by Russians today. This element has been repeated in history for many years. That's why these things are very important that we are noticing today. They have their roots in the history, and as you can see, I am only giving you some of the examples. I don't want to give you too many because I don't want to tear you up, because there is a lot of different effects, but I want to say something about Ukraine and the Great Terror so that you understand that I'm looking at you and I'm looking at what is happening in Russia and what is happening with the international agents and who is being arrested and how it was in Ukraine. I will give you such facts. In 1936, there were 15,717 people who were being arrested. In 1937, 159,000 of people. In 1 second, basically in one moment, all of those people were arrested in Ukraine. In 1938, 108,000 people were arrested in Ukraine. That is when they realized that they have to hide, that they to hide Yezhov, they have to put him away, and Berev came to power, and Yezhov was being, in 1940, he was being arrested and shot down because he basically signed a protocol that he was working for as an agent and as a terrorist. If we add to this arrested people that were arrested in Ukraine and all of the prisons that were being overloaded by people and all of the labor tabors that in 1956 were being and if we add more repressed and deportated people, Ukrainians that we didn't talk about, the deportation was a very important moment of repression and oppressions of the Soviet Union. And then we will understand that we have a great amount of people that were being deported, imprisoned, tortured, and basically repressed by the Soviet Union. And it is very important to remember that. But in order to finalize this lecture and this very important memorial here, the Jewish memorial not that far away, I wanted to end this lecture with memory of Babin Yar. You all know in Kiev, but no one knows Bagivnya. The other side, there is a village and there is a forest in which, by the facts that are being proved, 30,000 people, Polish officers that were being killed by not all of them buried, but there is facts about those officers. This is such a place where no president was going there until Papa Ivan Pavlov, who went to Bagivnya, and they were trying to build cottages there and houses there so that people live there. But now that it's being, now it's going to be basically sharing space with memorial memorial for the officers that were being killed and for the soldiers that were being murdered in that. In Bogivnya, there are different people laying there. Not all of them buried, but a lot of different people. There are Chekists, to say it shortly, victims and different victims. All of the secret services that were doing that. And in Kiev, people were being shot in the Yellow Palace. Executors that are in the concert house, Yellow Palace. There is a cellar there. It was very comfortable to basically shoot down the victims and torture them there. And I think that the realization of it's one of the biggest burials and of the NKVD officers in Ukraine. I know another place that could be that, but for now this is the biggest place of burial of this officers, and it is a place of memory and a memorial that it is very important to remember, and it is very important to remember. Let it be just a note in this tragic history of Soviet history and the Union. It is very important to remember about our history and our past, and are not gonna wait for in Germany or Europe. We have to remember it firstly by ourselves. And I started with quote, and I will finish with a quote from Salman Rushdie. I think to tell a story means to tell about today. To tell history means to tell about today. And I think this connects a lot about everything that I was saying today. And I think that this connects a lot of things that are happening today. Thank you very much for your attention and for being here today. Thank you very much, Professor. We are opening a Q&A where you can start asking questions either in English or Ukrainian. We have translators for there, so feel comfortable and put your hand up if you would like to ask a question. Thank you. Then I will use the first chance to ask Professor the question. Because our program is functioning from the last year of 5th of August. We started this program, Freedom UA. We were doing the exhibition performative action next to Brandenburger Gate. We were given as a donation 57 heads of Lenin heads, and we put them in trash bags in front of the Brandenburger Tor, and we were basically playing audio of Raphael Lemkin, and he was a Polish Jew, a lawyer, who basically described what is genocide and told about it in USA in 1953. What is the most important in this lecture is that he is saying that genocide started not from Holodomor, not from the famine, not from those dates that we know, 1933, but also Stalin and Lenin as people who were the oppressors. And also when we see on the discussions that there is a problem with Lenin, there is someone from the hall who gets up and leaves. Do you agree with Lemkin? Or what would you say? Do you agree with him? And what is the problematic with in the discourse of Germany? What is the problem with seeing Lenin as an enemy and as a bad person? I don't know how to talk to you about the German discourse after it is a tragedy for me. I don't know how to talk to you about that after I read an article. But then I will tell you, and I will answer you in a very interesting way, that no one thinks I'm subjective. I'm being subjective. Lenin took into his party organ, Molotova, who was until the end of days, he loved Stalin until the last day. And when someone told him, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich, when Stalin said that you were an international, a British agent, why did you love him until the end of days? If he wanted to basically let you go, he wanted to purge you. No, answered Molotov. I was always on the side of repressions and oppressions of Stalin, but when author Felix Chuyev, Russian author, who asked Molotov, Vyacheslav Mikhailovich, please tell us who was more strict, Lenin or Stalin? And Molotov answered in 1 second, Lenin. Lenin was more strict, and it wasn't, and this is not me saying, Molotov said that Lenin was very strict. He was very strict. And we were talking about that before, that when I was a student, I read reading archival documents of trials, and basically when all of the politicians were meeting up, I was always reading the documents the way that it was being stenograms that were being on the trials that were being written. I always read them in order to hear and see how Lenin was basically talking to the people and to see his character. And one of his sides, he was a very strict person. He was reflecting on a lot of things, but he was very flexible. We shouldn't forget about that. If you will read the Lenin's texts, the years of 1917, you don't understand. In such documents he was reading, in his documents he was writing that he is the biggest friend of Ukraine, that we should free Ukraine, that Ukraine are incredible people and we should let them be free. And the moment that he comes into power, he lets Poland go, he lets Finland go, but the moment Ukraine, no, he doesn't let Ukraine go. And that's the way it was. And if we talk seriously, then he was the fundamental initiator of not freeing Ukraine. We can't draw everything in the same colors, but that he was the foundation of oppressions and repressions in Ukraine. That is very, very important. And also what he said about the elites in Ukraine, and that he basically let go of the democratic parties in Ukraine and all of the Democrats. He got rid of them. So there are no questions for me. It is very important to understand that the situation that they lived in, but we need to understand that he was a very powerful politic. But in order to take power, he could do whatever he wanted to. And he always wanted to be the one in power, and he could do whatever he wanted, and he wanted to do whatever it takes in order to come into power. So there are no questions. He is the totalitarian, the ruler of the totalitarian regime.
Well, interestingly, the director of Ruski Mir Foundation, so he is the one of the predecessors of him. So thank you very much for your lecture. My name is Tanya. I have a trivial question. Do you believe, and is it actually realistic, that people, well, like Putin and people close to him, that they will be punished soon enough? Or maybe they will live many years and get old. Why do I ask this question? I'm now on internship at MDC, and the professor, my professor, he's really an esteemed professor coming from Western Germany, a German man. He asked me a question after Bucha and other atrocities. He asked me a question. Well, why wouldn't you let some European Commission and the occupied territories like Lugansk region, Donetsk region, and let people vote, and that we finally realize where these people want to live, in which state? Well, seemingly esteemed people who do incredible research and are in contact with Nobel Prize laureates and Nobel Prize winners, and are being published in scientific journals. Why do they ask me these questions? And he's not the only one. Yes, I know. Unfortunately, he's not the only one. Tatiana, thank you. Well, let me start with the second question first, about the voting. 1945, American Army and Soviet Army, back then the Red Army, a meeting at Elba. They are the American servicemen and Soviet servicemen get in contact. They drink something and so on and so forth. And the Soviet soldier says, well, I look at you, you have your uniform, you have food, you are joyful, you are enjoying yourselves, and in your country you can vote for your president, you have democracy and liberty. And we don't have anything. We have famine, dictatorship. And the American says, do you have any elections? He says, yes, we do. You just don't have to vote for Stalin, that's it. So this is the mentality. So you cannot explain him that Stalin was elected without voting, actually. So this is the logic behind it. So I can give only one simple advice. So he doesn't know the reality. He doesn't know what it means to false the voting process. So will you know for sure what I talk about? And speaking of your first question, so frankly, I'm really a pessimist about it. The evil is not even getting punished. Look at the destinies of dictators. For example, Franco, really he used to get into kidnapping and things. He was really a freak and nothing. And only now a discussion started in Spain. I've visited this veil of memory. So you know that he started building it before 1939. He was building a memorial for himself. And the founder of fascism in Italy, I forgot his name, but this was a memorial, and prisoners built it. Well, I think that the most appropriate variant for Russia is that Putin can get killed by his own men, and I am putting a stake on this. But seeing the features of the elites in Russian, it is also not an option. And the international trials, the Nuremberg trials, was a highly complicated process and was hard to get it by. So I'm still a pessimist about it, because maybe it is not good, maybe I'm supposed to say different things, but this is the way I see these things. Well, if I'm mistaken, I will be only glad to be mistaken. But as for me, I think that killing him is the best way to eliminate him. Well, it may be some Russian battalion or whatever you want to call it. So this is the best way to do it. But it is hard to tell. But out of history, we know that the evil doesn't get punished often. Well, actually, by the way, there is an exhibition about the massacre in Warsaw. Didn't get punished and had pension and managing positions and so on and so forth.
Professor, so I would like to go in this direction, feeling inspired by German history. So let's imagine that Ukraine will invade Moscow and Moscow will be occupied. And then, what is your dream? About which archive and which secrets you would like to reveal? Panie profesorze, jak zdobędziecie Moskwę i zaczniecie ją okupować, to które archiwum jest najciekawsze i jaką tajemnicę chciałby pan profesor odsłonić?
No to oczywiście, że dla mnie to jest archiwum FSB. Ja, знаєте jak,
So the FSB archives, this is quite obvious. Well, as for me, I wouldn't want us to be in Moscow, frankly. Being in Moscow is the Polish destiny, and Polish people have been to Moscow. We went to a conference to Warsaw once, and there is a historian, Andrzej Baczkowski, you may know him. He went to have a smoke, and there was a period where Putin disappeared, so he was not in public for like 2 weeks or so, and they said that he went to see Kabaeva, or I don't know. So anyways, he was not seen, and Baczkowski was smoking his cigarette, and he said, well, you know that this is a chance for the Polish people, don't you understand? While he's not in Kremlin. So I don't know. I really recommend everyone in this respect to read Wasyl Korzelianko, the Defilade in Moscow. He was a great Ukrainian writer. He died as a young man, but he wrote 2 genius things, Defilade in Moscow and Konotop. Konotop is just fantastic. You just have to read it. The plot is really simple. A journalist, not a sincere journalist, is being sent to the past, and he is writing things for Jewish newspaper, Russian newspaper, and he's writing completely opposite things. You just have to read it. It is really ironic and really really funny. Maybe an alternative history. The Defilade is an alternative history, but still, I really want Ukraine to be in NATO. I don't want anything else for Ukraine. So this is my humble wish, because I can see any other way out, because it will go the same way in the future. So if we don't have the guarantees, the history will repeat. Thank you. Please, Grzegorz.
And then...
Dear Professor Shapoval, first of all, thanks a lot for this really insightful lecture. I think I learned a lot. And 1 second. Does it work? Okay. Oh, great. So my question to you would be, I think that oftentimes when you observe Western discourses about Russia, the history of Russia, but also the Soviet Union, there seems to be at times a sort of mild obsession about the relationship between Russia and the West. Now, what I mean by this is, for just to mention 2 examples, even some really well-intentioned American liberals like Arthur Schlesinger seem to suggest that basically the Russians were maybe even the major victim of the Soviet Union, because it was some sort of Western ideology or philosophy forced upon them. On the other hand, it seems like every 3rd historical book also starts with Peter I and his interest for the West, and there's always this huge lament why Russia wouldn't go this way. And I think these perspectives are quite naive, but it would be interesting to hear from your point of view, how much do you think the evil of Russian history, whether it be the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, how much of it is rooted in genuinely Russian parochial factors, and how much of it is some sort of obsession with the West, with some ill implementations of it, and just bad policies? Thank you.
Ну, я може почну з самих росіян.
Okay, let me start with the Russians. With a myth that has been ruined by a philosopher I'm really fond of, Chadayev. You may have heard of him. He was a unique person who was proclaimed mad by the Tsar because he only published one of his philosophic letter. Chadayev, when he looked at Russia, he said the following: you know, Russia is a country which lives for the purpose to give other countries a lesson how they are not supposed to live, how they should not live. This is the first idea of his. And the second idea of his, very important in my opinion, you should love your motherhood with your eyes open. I think Russians have many problems rooted in the fact that they love their motherhood the way they love it. And this is the way they are trying to persuade the West in their ideas. Many things have been told already. The great Russian culture. I love Russian music. I love Rachmaninoff, for example. I don't like Dostoevsky, but Dostoevsky has Ukrainian roots. Yeah, so I don't like him. Yeah, that's his destiny. But, you know, culture plays a role only when it rules the masses, when it influences the nation. In Russia, we have a gap. We can listen to the music of Eduard Artemiev and see what happened in Bucha or in other places, or we can listen to music of Tchaikovsky or Schnittke and observe what we observe, and observe those people that have any connection whatsoever to Russian culture. So this mythology, I think the West is really hypnotized by it. Yeah, I think hypnotized is the right notion. And you know, this war has highlighted many features. I speak about gravity and atrocities, and well, let me tell you about myself. Maybe it is not that modest, but when the war started, before the war started, I got a letter from my colleagues in France, Italy, Poland, and even I was shocked from Australia. So why should they care about Ukraine? But my colleague from Sorbonne, he sent me a map. He said a column is approaching you, and I was in a circle. I was between Bucha and Borodyanka. Yeah, so we survived. And I cooperated with Moscow's Office of Memorial, and Russia proclaimed me an extremist because of one of my publications about Chekists, the Secret Service officers. Memorial gave me a solicitor, and we had a trial in Mishchansky court of Moscow. And there were horrible experts involved in that trial, but any person from Moscow gave me a call. Not a single one. And I thought, how come we were friends? We were sincere. I didn't ask anything of them. You know, there's something in it which pulls us apart, pushes us apart. Or when I listen to an interview of a lady who tells about a widow who tells about her husband who died at the front line, and now she has a key of a brand new apartment. Astolf de Custine wrote quite brilliantly, you know, I am disgusted not only by the fact that Russians have bribery and other things. I am really disgusted by the fact that they want to pretend that they are like us. They want to imitate us, not be, but fake it until they make it, sort of. And this is a great false. So we have seen it during the war. So if we should deem Russians to be victims, you know, Ukrainians also have victim kind of mentality. Sometimes it is appropriate, sometimes it is not. But still, Russians are many. To tell that they are victims, it is when the Soviet Union collapsed. Do you know what communists in Russia said? They said we are the biggest victims of Soviet Russia. Soviet Union. We didn't have the party committee of Russia. They said. So this trend of victimization of themselves, self-victimization, is a great one. And I can tell you that there are talented people in Russia who can do it well. And this is what distinguishes us from them, because Russia does propaganda. Russia can do it, and they are doing it. And Ukraine didn't do it. And Ukraine didn't work with the eastern regions. What happened in Donbass is a horrible mistake of our government. I have been to Donbass by then, and I know what people thought, what was on their minds, and the Russian propaganda worked then. We have to do something about it, but how? Ukrainians have to prove, just like our armed forces have proven it, that they can fight and not give up. This, like in other spheres, for example, about this prosecuted Renaissance, not many people know about it, or our researchers in the diaspora write about it, but it is important to know. It is important to speak about it, but not only to speak about it, it is important to be heard. I think the war has given Ukraine a chance to be heard, and may it be like that. But thank you for your question.
We know each other for a long time, for a very long time, and I have a question for you. Benedict, one minute. I want to say something. This is a historic moment. This Benedict is basically drove me to Zhytomyr in 1995, and we opened a memorial for Alexander Shumsky in Ukraine. And I wasn't the initiator. I just wrote about Shumsky, and Benedict was the initiator, and he was the one who drove me there and opened and initiated this memorial. I now work in the Ministry of Inner Work in Germany, and outside work with Ukraine, but I like it there as well. And also I can work and live with this work. I want to ask you something. I know that you are for a very long time working on the reality of Germany. Yeah, there are some facts that most of the books that were being quoted are here very famous, but most of them are even translated into German. But why society in Germany doesn't react to it in the way that we do, and why no one have been believing this truth, and why does this Russophilism exist in Germany, even though we had these books translated into Germany? How will you describe that, and what would you say about that? Do you have a proposal how we can change that in Germany, change this problem of Russophilism in Germany? This is not very polite to talk bad about the country you're in as a guest, but I, as a German, allowing you to speak in a bad way if you would wish to. Thank you very much for this question. I am very, very excited to see you here today. Obviously, the way that people from other countries react to such a question, and when they come to Ukraine and they ask, how should we live? How are we supposed to live that way? Americans, when they come to Ukraine, they always say, for example, I am not a citizen of this country, I don't want to say anything about this. I will say a simple thing. I think that Russophilism in Germany came from the Second World War II and the history between the Soviet and Russian. It wasn't separated. It was basically one thing. And that's the way that they talk about the World War II, that the Russian victims, Russian prisoners, not Soviet prisoners. And this is why it's such a big thing. And also the recipe proposal how to fix this problem of Russophilism in Germany. We need more information of Ukraine and also more questions to Ukraine. We need an institute of Ukraine in Germany. We also need promotion that you have to learn more about Ukraine, that this is important. There was in Berlin at some point a Ukrainian institute, but it was closed down in 1945 and it was created in 1927. There were a lot of financing. There was German financing, there were Ukrainian financing there, but it existed for a very long time, and it gave a lot of propaganda and a lot of knowledge provided about Ukraine. And this was very good because it promoted Ukraine in Germany, and in Europe it was very important because they gave a lot of information about Ukraine. And when I was talking up to my German colleagues when I was here in Germany, they told me, they were laughing but also being serious at the same time. Why are you so shocked that we don't know about Ukraine that much? We don't know about Poland almost anything. So how are we supposed to know anything about Ukraine? Because Ukraine is still, when it was with Crimea, it was the biggest country in Europe, territory-wise. But people still didn't know about it. And what I did there now, what I was editing the books in Germany, they were basically asking me to edit books about Ukraine in German, and I was reading different fragments about Ukraine in the 20th century, and I see some things that are being hidden and that are not being talked about in those books. And this is what I say, that we need to talk about the Weimar Republic, for example, and that Ukraine was before that happening there. It's not in the books, and this is what you need to add there. There were a lot of people who were going through different countries in Europe, and they were talking about Ukraine, but that is also hidden. The information is not given. There is also not a lot of translation of Ukrainian books to Germany, and Ukrainian archives that are being translated to German. For example, about Holodomor, we're quoting people, not Mikhailo Goichenko, who, for example, right now released a book that is so sincere about the Holodomor, but no one quotes it. And some people quote other books about Holodomor, and this is the way that I give people proposals, advice. I give them resources. I give them books that they could quote, that they could basically show people here in Germany in order to show information about Ukraine. This is the way that I propose to work with it. This is the way that I propose to give advice. We need to work on massive information about Ukraine. I watched this movie, Investen nicht Neues, that was made by from the book of Remarque, and I looked at this movie and I realized that the accent in this movie is that French people are very aggressive and mean. And I also watched another German movie, Unsere Väter, unsere Mutter, and Our Mothers, Our Fathers, and they were Ukrainian police officers there. And why are they in the Russian city? No one knows. And it was written that it was a Ukrainian police officer. And this is just a misinformation. This is something that people don't know and they don't work on it. And that's why my proposal is that we work on that we give more information about Ukraine, that in the books of German history, I mean in schools of history in German, we need to translate and give more information on Ukraine. And this is the way that I would answer your question.
I have one question. Одне питання. As a historian, do you feel that, especially after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, do you feel that the warnings that you are giving with your research, do you feel that they are listened to and they are understood more? I'm thinking particularly about the West, which didn't really understand before the full-scale invasion. And do you also think that in the West... And do you also feel that in the West, the society and political world are ready to talk about decolonizing history from Russian propaganda and decolonizing the culture that we've been learning from?
I'm so grateful to you for this question. This is a very, very good question. I will start from decolonization of knowledge. This is a work that started on the last forums of scientists in the US. And there were debates on this topic, the decolonization of knowledge, and they were talking about that this isn't an easy protest, and it's not going to be, because in the West there exists a lot of a big generation of people who were Russia concentrated. They were concentrated on Russia, and that is basically their bread, and this is their profession. So that's why the process is not going to be easy. That's the way that Robert Sunyi was laughing and serious at the same time when he was talking to me. You know, it was so nice to work with Soviet Union. There were no problems. There were a lot of countries in one union, and we could work on them. And now we need to separate the countries. We need to separate in the different regions. We need to separate different history, and we need to tell people about the knowledge that we have about the decolonization. There is a big rebellion within the decolonization process, but there it is obvious that there is a lot hanging and being dependent on the Ukrainian scientists, and that they are being able and being given a chance to give their knowledge, and this is not as easy as it sounds. But this process is starting now, and I read more than one publication about the debate on decolonization. And you know, another detail that is very interesting, I read one material, an article where academic article, where it says that people are pushing the pro-Russian narratives. There is being told that basically in the West they pushed the pro-Russian propaganda and pro-Russian narratives. Their names being told, and there are not very pleasant people that are there that were given financing, that were being paid for pushing pro-Russian information into the Western front of knowledge. And this is also a big problem that we need to think of when we think of decolonization, and if we want to get rid of it. Considering the influence of full-scale invasion, it has influenced a lot of things. And I can tell you one example of Polish colleagues that I have, you know, how dramatic was the problem of Volyn for Polish people and for Ukrainians in 1943. And when this war has started, Polish people, of course, will not cancel the date of a memorial of Volyn, that is being the genocide of Polish people for Poland and Polish people. But this is very important to discuss. It is important to talk about it and to have a debate. Because in different countries there are different powers. In Poland and also like in Ukraine, there are nationalists that do not want to discuss have an academic debate or discussion. But we did that in historic debate discussion of Ukrainian Polish scientists and historians, and we did pretty well. We just discussed. We didn't want to find out immediately the whole truth, but we did have a debate, and it worked out. And I had this experience where I was discussing a movie that was made by Wojtek Smarzowski, Volyn in 1943, and with Professor Motyka and this director. We were in Munich, and in the cinema that was 100 for 100 people, and there were so many people, so many Germans who came to this film. And we were having a very good debate and a good discussion, and it was very great. And I, as a historian, said, what is this shown in this film? This is not true, that Ukrainians basically put holy water and were religious about the weapons. And I told him that this is not true, wasn't a fact. And he actually heard me and he understood what I was saying. And I think this is the best way that we can have. We can have a dialogue with people. We can talk about it. You know, this full-scale invasion for a lot of historians happened as a way to look at the World War II from a different perspective, and this is very, very important. Now we see the Soviet army that was so great and so unbreakable, and we see that that is not true. And we see that the film director and author Dovzhenko was writing about. We see the truth where he wrote that boys from the village, very young, were just being pushed to the front lines in the Soviet Union, and we see that right now as well. They weren't given weapons; they were just pushed. And everyone tells us that they were being grown up on the films about the great Soviet army. But now, since the full-scale invasion, we see the truth and see that it wasn't that way. And this is, I think, that the story of the way that the World War II was described, full-scale invasion influenced it a lot. And we have a unique opportunity right now and generation in which we live right now. We see the war happening right now. We see it in the internet. We see it in the television. It is in front of us. It wasn't happening back then in the way that it was happening now. We can see it every day. I was reading the diary of Savchuk in 1941 in Berlin. And he was saying that Berlin, until the very last moment, was living a perfect and very easy life. And then, until the war came, everyone realized that the catastrophe was happening, that it was here happening right now. So what we see right now, and the world is seeing it every day, it is very important that we can see that every day in order to write history and in order to describe this war and in order to memorize what was happening during it. The explosion of the Kakhovska hydroelectric station, for me, really reminded me of Dniprovska hydroelectric station. It really reminded me and everyone, and it was not organized back then. It wasn't planned that way, and this reminded me of the situation. And I don't know if this is the way it is happening, that it happened today, if it was planned, not organized. But now I understand that Dnipro hydroelectric station that was being bombed, exploded in the Soviet Union, the soldiers were killed as well. So it wasn't planned, and the soldiers and they lived, who lived there, people who lived there, they died, and the soldiers lived as well. And now we can understand that, because this is what could happen today if people wouldn't be evacuated. So we see that full-scale invasion really influences
the
the
opportunity
history
just
of
for the
today.
last really short question, if it's left in the space. And that means that we will transfer to like some maybe private questions. Thank you, Professor Yurii Shapoval, for being with us for this lecture. Thank you for all being here. And let's stay united, let's stay together. Slava Ukraini.
Slava.